My grandmother didn't die in a hospital. She died in a recliner, in a living room that smelled like burnt coffee and Febreze, with a quilt pulled up to her chin and a family around her that had already divided up her furniture before her eyes even closed. And I wasn't there, because my cousin Diane made sure of it. But here's what Diane didn't know. 3 weeks before that night, before the phone calls, before the lawyers, before everything, I'd already been to see Grandma Ruth alone. I'd sat with her in that ICU room in San Antonio while the monitors beeped, and the hallway outside smelled like antiseptic and someone's cold lunch. And we'd talked. Really talked. The kind of conversation you only have when both of you know time is running out. What happened after that conversation is why I'm here today. Before I go any further, have you ever been deliberately kept away from someone you loved in their final moments? I'm not talking about a misunderstanding. I mean intentionally. Tell me in the comments, because what I'm about to share still doesn't feel real to me. Let me take you back. I grew up in a small house outside of San Antonio, Texas. Nothing fancy. One of those neighborhoods where everyone knows your business and the local Heb grocery store is basically the town square. My grandmother, Ruth Elaine Garza, lived 20 minutes away, close enough that I could be at her kitchen table in the time it took her to finish making her coffee. She was the kind of woman who remembered your birthday without Facebook, who kept a drawer full of birthday cards, already stamped, already addressed, who taught me how to make tamales every December, and always answered the phone on the first ring. I was close to her in a way that's hard to explain. My parents divorced when I was 9. My dad disappeared somewhere into West Texas and didn't look back. My mom, she tried. She really did. But she was working double shifts at a call center and barely keeping the lights on. So Grandma Ruth became my anchor. I spent summers there. School breaks. The occasional Tuesday when I just needed somewhere that felt safe. She called me her shadow. I called her my person. Now here's where I have to be honest about something. I was not perfect in this situation. Not by a long shot. My enabling flaw, and I've had a lot of time to think about this, was that I kept the peace. At all costs. I smiled through Christmases that made my stomach hurt. I laughed at dinners when Diane talked over me like I wasn't even sitting there. I swallowed things that should have been said years ago because I told myself that's what Grandma Ruth needed from me. Calm. Steady. No drama. I was so focused on being the good one that I handed the wheel to the wrong person entirely. Diane Galvez is my first cousin on my mother's side. She's 4 years older than me, lives in a nice part of Austin, a house with a porch and one of those mailboxes that looks like a little barn, and she has always had the family's ear. She's charming the way a realtor is charming. Warm right up until the moment she needs something, and then something shifts behind her eyes and you realize the warmth was always strategic. I watched her do it my whole life. I just kept telling myself I was being paranoid. Grandma Ruth had money. Not a fortune, but real, earned money. Her house in the Monte Vista neighborhood of San Antonio was paid off. She had a retirement account from 30 years working for the county, a savings account she'd been feeding since before I was born, and a piece of land, about 11 acres, out near Hondo, that her father had left her. Put together, we're talking somewhere in the range of $400,000. That number matters. Remember it. Stories like this happen in the shadows every day. Inside families. Around dining room tables. Behind smiles at holiday dinners. That's why I share them. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, stick around. Because this one goes deep. Grandma Ruth was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in the spring. It wasn't a surprise. She'd been having symptoms for over a year. But hearing it out loud in a doctor's office with the fluorescent lights humming overhead made it feel suddenly, brutally real. She was 81. Her heart was working at about 30% capacity. The cardiologist at Methodist Hospital downtown used phrases like quality of life and realistic expectations. And Grandma Ruth sat there in her good blouse and her pearl earrings and said, "Okay, what do I do next?" That was her. Even then. Practical to the bone. Diane inserted herself immediately. Within a week, she was the one scheduling appointments. Driving Grandma to follow-ups. Sitting in on conversations with the doctors. She framed it as love. And maybe, on some level, it was. But I started noticing things. Small things at first. Grandma Ruth would mention something to me on the phone. a question she had about her medications, a conversation she'd had with the estate attorney, and when I'd bring it up to Diane, she'd look at me with this patient, slightly sad expression, and say, "I don't know where she's getting that from." She gets confused sometimes, you know. Grandma Ruth. Confused. The woman who still did the crossword in pen. I started doubting myself. That's the thing nobody tells you about this kind of manipulation. It doesn't come at you like a wave. It comes like fog. Slow. Quiet. You don't notice you can't see until you're already lost. I started second-guessing my own memory of conversations. I'd replay phone calls in my head, wondering if I'd misheard something, misunderstood something. Diane would give me these little looks at family gatherings. Not mean, never outwardly mean, just this particular tilt of her head that said, "You're being difficult." And every time, something in me would fold. I'd been folding my whole life. It was a reflex. Then Grandma Ruth had a bad episode in July, the second one that summer. She was rushed to the ICU at Methodist, fluid around her lungs, oxygen levels tanking. My mom called me, and I drove the 40 minutes from my apartment in Alamo Heights, through traffic, with my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I got to the hospital. I found her room. And standing outside the door, arms crossed, already positioned like she owned the hallway, was Diane. She told me Grandma was resting, that the doctors said limited visitors, that it was better if we kept it calm. I asked when I could go in. She said she'd let me know. I sat in that waiting room for 3 hours. Diane went in and out twice. A nurse I caught in the hallway told me, quietly, kindly, that there was no visitor restriction on the chart. No restriction. Diane had just made that up. Standing there in her linen blazer, her voice all honey and concern, she had simply decided I wouldn't go in that room. And the worst part? I'd almost let her. I really want to know, if someone blocked you from seeing a sick family member, would you push back in the moment, or would you do what I did and sit down? Tell me in the comments. Because I still wonder what would have happened if I just walked past her. I walked in anyway. Diane called my name once, sharp, like she was calling a dog. I kept walking. Grandma Ruth was awake. She was propped up on pillows, with a hospital bracelet on her wrist and her silver hair loose instead of in her usual bun. And she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. But her eyes were completely clear. She saw me, and something shifted in her face. Not surprise. Relief, the kind that tells you a person has been waiting. She reached out and took my hand and said, "Close the door, baby. There are some things I need you to know." What Grandma Ruth told me in that hospital room, in 45 minutes, in a voice barely above a whisper, while the monitors beeped and the IV dripped, was the clearest, most deliberate thing she had ever said to me. She wasn't confused. She wasn't scared. She was angry. And she had a plan. And she needed me to be the one to carry it out, because she already knew she wasn't going to make it home from that hospital. Not the first time, anyway. What she asked me to do next was something I'd never done before. Cold. Methodical. The opposite of every instinct I have. But I did it. Every single step. Grandma Ruth spoke for 45 minutes without stopping. She told me that 3 months earlier, before the first bad episode, before the ICU, before any of this, Diane had come to her house on a Sunday afternoon with a notary and a set of documents she described as an updated estate plan. Grandma Ruth said Diane sat across from her at her own kitchen table and walked her through it page by page, patient and thorough, the way you'd explain a cable bill to an elderly parent. She'd signed. Because Diane was family. Because she trusted her. Because nobody expects the person handing them coffee to be the one picking their pocket. The new documents named Diane as sole executor and primary beneficiary of the estate. Grandma Ruth had figured it out 6 weeks later. A letter came from the law office, a follow-up on some paperwork, and she called the number on the letterhead herself. She asked questions. She wrote down the answers in her little spiral notebook, the one she kept by the phone with the blue pen attached by a rubber band. By the time she hung up, she knew exactly what had been done, and she'd spent the following weeks trying to figure out who she could trust to help her undo it. She'd landed on me. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand before I left that room. On it was the name of the original attorney who had drafted her will, a woman named Patricia Ochoa, whose office was on Blanco Road, about 10 minutes from Grandma's house. She'd been handling Grandma Ruth's legal affairs for 15 years. Grandma told me Patricia didn't know about the new documents yet. She told me to go see her. She told me to bring the blue notebook. And then she looked at me with those clear, dark eyes and said, "Don't tell anyone you're going. Not your mother. Not anyone." I drove to Patricia Ochoa's office the very next morning. Look, I'm going to be honest, I'm not a legal person. I work in dental office administration. My idea of a high-stakes situation is a patient disputing an insurance claim. I don't know anything about estate law. I didn't know what undue influence meant before that week. I didn't know that a person could challenge a document if they could demonstrate that their mental capacity had been compromised, or that someone had exploited a position of trust to manipulate a vulnerable adult into signing. I didn't know any of that. Patricia Ochoa spent 90 minutes teaching me. She pulled Grandma Ruth's original will from her files. It was dated 7 years prior. In it, the estate was divided. 60% to my mother and her siblings, 40% split between the grandchildren, with specific provisions for the land near Hondo. It was thorough. It was deliberate. It was exactly the kind of document a sharp, clear-minded woman writes when she's thought hard about what she wants her life to mean after she's gone. Patricia read through the documents Grandma Ruth had signed at her kitchen table, and her expression did something I'll never forget. It didn't shift into outrage. It went very, very still. She said, "This is a problem, and I think we can fix it." What followed was 12 of the most boring, methodical days of my life. I drove to Grandma's house while Diane was at work and photographed every document in that blue notebook. Dates, names, the exact wording Diane had used during the signing. I got affidavits from 2 of Grandma's neighbors who had witnessed Diane's visits that summer and noticed how Grandma seemed quieter, less herself, after each one. I got a statement from Grandma's cardiologist at Methodist confirming that her cognitive function was completely intact at the time the documents were signed, which actually worked in our favor, because it meant what happened wasn't confusion. It was coercion. I bought a cheap accordion folder from the Office Depot on Loop 410, and I labeled every section with a sticky note. That accordion folder became my whole life for 2 weeks. I keep thinking about this. If Grandma Ruth hadn't chosen to trust me in that hospital room, none of this would have happened. She had other grandchildren. She had her own kids. But she chose me. Does it feel like a blessing or a burden to be the one someone trusts with something this heavy? I genuinely don't know the answer. Tell me yours. Then, Grandma Ruth came home from the hospital. Not for the last time. That came later. This was a discharge. She was stable enough to go home with oxygen and a home health aide. I expected Diane to push for her own choices there too. And she did. She already had someone lined up, a woman she'd apparently been in contact with for weeks. What Diane didn't know was that Patricia Ochoa had quietly filed paperwork with the county that week. Nothing public yet. Nothing Diane would see unless she went looking. Just a legal marker. A timestamp. Proof that the original will had been in active review before any subsequent events. We'd sealed the record. And the clock had started. Grandma Ruth declined faster than any of us expected. October came, and she was in and out of the hospital twice more. By November, she was on continuous oxygen. By the 3rd week of November, the doctors were using the word hospice. Diane moved fast. I'll give her that. The moment the word hospice entered the conversation, something in her shifted into a higher gear. She started staying at Grandma's house overnight, answering the phone when family called, controlling who visited and for how long. There was a dinner at my aunt's house where Diane gave a little speech, tearful, composed, about how hard it was to be the one carrying the weight of Grandma's care. Everyone nodded. My mother squeezed Diane's hand. I sat there and ate my rice and didn't say a word. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Diane pulled Grandma out of Methodist against medical advice. That's not an exaggeration. There's a form for that. It's called an AMA discharge, against medical advice. The doctors had wanted to keep Grandma Ruth for observation. Diane signed the paperwork, loaded her into a car, and brought her home. She told the family it was because Grandma wanted to be in her own house. And maybe Grandma did say that. I can't know every conversation that happened in that room. But I know that no one else was consulted, no one else was called. And the home health aide Diane had chosen happened to have a background that, let's say, prioritized loyalty to the person writing the checks. I found out from my mother, who found out from a cousin, who heard it at the gas station. I called Patricia Ochoa from the parking lot of a Whataburger. She already knew. She'd been monitoring. She told me, "Sit tight. Don't confront anyone. Don't tip our hand." She said we were close. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes. The heater in my car has never worked right, and it was 46 degrees outside, and I just sat there watching the traffic go by on I-10, eating a cold order of fries, thinking about my grandmother in that recliner. Grandma Ruth died on a Sunday morning, 4 days later. I wasn't there. Diane made sure of it. She'd told my mother the night before that Grandma was resting comfortably and that they'd call if anything changed. They didn't call. By the time my mother phoned me, it was done. Diane sent a group text 2 hours later. It said, "Grandma is at peace. I'll be handling arrangements. Please respect the family's privacy during this time." Her own text, in her own words. "I'll be handling arrangements." She didn't even wait until the body was cold. That group text. I've read it probably 100 times since then. Every time I think I've processed it, I read it again and feel it fresh. Have you ever received a message that told you everything you needed to know about a person in a single sentence? Tell me in the comments. Patricia filed the formal challenge the following Tuesday. The documentation was airtight. The original will, the timeline of Diane's visits, the notary records, the neighbor's affidavits, the cardiologist's statement, and a particularly damaging detail that Patricia had uncovered during her own investigation. The notary Diane had brought to that Sunday afternoon kitchen signing was someone Diane had used for a previous real estate transaction. Not a neutral party, a known associate. Diane's attorney called Patricia's office within 48 hours of the filing. I imagine she sat down when she got the news. The legal process took 8 months. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was emails and phone calls and a mediation session in a beige conference room in downtown San Antonio, where Diane sat across from Patricia and me and kept her eyes on the table and her hands very still in her lap. Her attorney negotiated. Patricia held the line. In the end, the court set aside the documents Diane had obtained and reinstated the original will, with some modifications to reflect updated circumstances. The estate was distributed, as Grandma Ruth had always intended. Diane didn't go to prison. I want to be clear about that. What she did existed in a legal gray area. Undue influence is hard to prove criminally, even when the civil case is clear. She faced no criminal charges. She lost the estate. She lost her standing in the family. She lost the house she'd apparently already started mentally decorating. But she didn't lose her freedom. And I've had to make a certain kind of peace with that, because I don't have a choice. Some justice is partial. You take it anyway. My relationship with my mother changed after this. Not broke, but changed. She felt guilty for not seeing it sooner. I felt guilty for keeping so much of it from her while it was happening. We've had hard conversations, the kind where neither person gets to be completely right. The kind that leave a bruise even when they go well. The land near Hondo is still in the family. My mother's name is on the deed now. I still go to Grandma Ruth's old house sometimes. It was sold as part of the estate settlement. None of us could afford to buy out the others. And a young couple lives there now. They've painted the front door a dark green, that I don't think Grandma would have chosen. But I think she would have appreciated that someone is using the kitchen again, that someone is making coffee in the morning and letting the smell fill up the rooms. I drove past it last October, on what would have been her 83rd birthday. I sat out front for a few minutes. Then I went to the Heb on Culebra and bought a birthday card. Addressed it to no one. Left it in the car. Some habits you keep, because getting rid of them would cost too much. Here's what I still think about. Grandma Ruth chose me in that hospital room. She had other people she could have trusted. She chose me, and I did what she asked. But I also wonder, if I'd said something sooner, pushed back on Diane years earlier instead of keeping the peace, would any of this have even gotten that far? I don't have an answer, but I'd rather sit with that question than pretend it doesn't exist. If you've ever looked back at a moment where staying silent cost you something, I think you know exactly what I mean. I'm not going to tell you this story has a clean ending. The money was protected. The will was honored. But Grandma Ruth is still gone, and Diane is still out there, at that house in Austin with the barn mailbox, And she still posts on Facebook about family and gratitude every Thanksgiving. The family doesn't gather the same way anymore. The people who believed her look away when my name comes up, and I still sometimes sit in parking lots at 46 degrees, eating cold fries, turning things over in my head. That's the part they don't show you in the movies. The win doesn't fix the before. But Grandma Ruth got what she wanted, and I got to be the one to make sure of it. That's enough.